first or your very earliest musical memory?
My earliest musical memory is my grandmother used to write with a guy named George Sand, who wrote When Irish Eyes Are Smiling. And then my mother wrote quite a bit for country people, Gene Autry and those people. In fact, she just had a standard declared, and she's 86.
Wow.
In Fort Worth, Texas. It's called Miles and Miles of Texas That Asleep at the Wheel did, and Gene Autry and a bunch of other people along the way. And she's still writing, so that's where I really came from, my grandmother, and sitting around the piano and everybody playing at my grandmother's, Mamie Jo Adams in Joshua, Texas, and then my mother, and little bitty studios and little, little recorders, and guys coming up and with a bottle of beer and torn T-shirts or in a tuxedo, whatever. Everybody seemed like they wanted to sing and make a record or play a guitar or do something. So that's what I really remember. I think that's how it got it all in. And we used to sit around the radio and listen to the Grand Ole Opry. My time about half looped, and Sinatra came in, and everybody was hollering Frankie, and I was too, because I wanted to hear him. But he was kind enough to tell me to finish before he'd do anything, and then he sang a song. And I thought, what a great way to make a living. So I guess Sinatra was really the one who probably put that seed there along the way.
When did your interest turn to the production side of things, and what actually was your first production?
It turned to that when I was started writing songs, and in order to get a song recorded, you had to make a demo. And I had some access to some wonderful musicians, so it just started getting better and better. And all of a sudden, the record companies were asking me along the way. It's like, well, these don't really sound like demos or anything. They sound like masters. And from there, I got my first chance with a man named Clyde Otis. He was the first black producer in the business. He did Dinah Washington and Clyde McPhatter and all of those people, and he took me on to run his publishing companies. And then he helped me a job at a company called Cap, K-A-P-P Records, with Dave Cap and Mickey Cap, who were wonderful people. They had a small company, and they produced Jane Morgan and Roger Williams, who were a singer and a keyboard player back then, pretty big. And I went over there for a little bit, and while I was there, I heard a record of Aretha. And the guy that was on it that did the arranging and producing was a guy named Robert Mercy, and he was running CBS. And I called him one day and told him that I had a girl from North Carolina that I was going to record, and wanted to use him. And he said, well, he ran CBS. He said he couldn't do that. And I said, come on, you can do that. And he said, well, it'll be 6 months. You don't want to wait. And I said, I'll wait a year. I'll wait until they fire me if you'll do it. And so he finally decided to come over, and I got involved with him, and he did the arrangements. And then I called him one day to take some songs over there, just as publisher, and he heard them, and he said, hell, that's better than everybody I've got here that's producing. He said, you want to come to work for me? And I said, no, I'll come to work with you. I won't come to work for you. And he said, great. So he ran CBS, so I came into CBS, and I think the first production I got, I remember he came in there and he brought me an album of Patti Page. Remember she had Doggy in the Window?
Ah, yes.
He brought me an album of hers and said, here, see what you can do with this old scumbag. And I mean, he was the reverend as hell anyway. And I listened to her, and I always loved Patti Page because she was from Oklahoma and a wonderful singer, and she was a wonderful girl. And I went looking and found a song called Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte from the movie, and cut her and got her on the Academy Awards show, and she sang it, and that was the beginning of it. And I had some stuff with her, and then I took over Simon and Garfunkel, and then I took over Dylan, and then I found a bunch of other people, and then eventually ended up working with Aretha and Louis Armstrong and just hundreds of people. And that's basically how it came about. I was an artist at one time. I recorded a couple of things on Dot Records and Mercury Records, but somehow or other they sandwiched me in between Tommy Sands and Ricky Nelson one day, and when Tommy got on, It was Tommy Sands and then me and Ricky Nelson. When Tommy got on, everybody was screaming, "We want Ricky." And when I got on, you couldn't even hear. All you could hear was, "We want Ricky." And I thought, well, that's a pretty dumb way to make a living. I wasn't suited for that.
Yeah.
I was suited for other things, but I wasn't suited for that, because when Charlie Daniels gets up, or one of those guys in Omaha, Nebraska, or Tampa, Florida, and they say, "Tampa, we love you," Charlie really does love those people. All of those people really do love them, and I don't have that same thing. What I want is to get people high by the albums and by the artists and by the records and all that I do. That means more to me than having people up there hollering for me. Not that they would have anyway. I don't think I would have ever been a good artist, you know. I was working with all of those other people, and it's almost impossible to write or do anything. I had about 50 or 60 hits, I guess, these songs that I wrote with my wife and all that, but it's not the same thing, not the same feeling that I had.
With Bob Dylan during his transition over to his electric phase, did he come to you knowing exactly what he wanted there?
I worked with Bob Dylan on Highway 61. I came in on Highway 61, and Dylan always knew what it was. What you have today and what it has evolved into is heroes. You got producers, and they find somebody, and they have to make it sound a lot like what the record company wants or what they heard last time in order to get it in. You come with somebody so new and so fresh and so unusual, because I remember when John Hammond, who to me was the best music man that ever lived, he was at CBS, found nobody will ever find as many artists as he found. But when he brought Dylan in, the people at CBS laughed at him. They used to call him Hammond's Folly. And they said, "Why in the world, John, would you bring that guy in there? He can't sing, and he'll never get his music played." And Simon and Garfunkel, they said, "Poets? What are you doing with a poet?" Leonard Cohen, they said, "Why do you want that old drone?" And if you'd have listened to all of those people, you'd have been out on the goddamn street selling peanuts. You know, so I just went ahead and pretty much did as I always chose to do, whatever the hell I wanted, and gave the artist complete and total creative freedom. And Dylan always knew what he wanted. He never had to second guess, but it was also a thing of nebulous. It was like the clouds. You were reaching out. You didn't know what Al Cooper was going to play. I didn't know which instrument Dylan was going to pick up next, but I didn't care. I didn't judge his songs. I didn't judge Leonard Cohen's songs or Paul Simon. I think that would have been foolish. All I was there for was a conduit so they didn't have to repeat themselves, and they didn't have to go back and get something because it was screwed up. And I know Johnny Cash came in to me and said, "I wanted to work at go to a prison to record for 8 years, and nobody would ever let me." And I picked up the phone and called Folsom and Quentin, two of the worst prisons in the United States. Got through to Folsom first, got the warden on the phone, and handed him the phone. And the next thing he knew, we were recording at Folsom Prison, and it was about $7 million. Then we went to San Quentin, and it was about $8 million. And I had a thing called A Boy Named Sue, which was a single that came out of it. That wasn't my idea. It wasn't my idea to do those songs electric and all. That was Dylan and Paul Simon and Leonard Cohen and Johnny Cash. They know what they want. I helped them. I mean, I'm not some guy out there off the street or something, or else I wouldn't have been with Dylan for 7 or 8 years. I wouldn't have been with him for 7 or 8 minutes. You know, I'm sure I had something to offer along the way, or I wouldn't have stayed with him.
Did you notice much change in Dylan's approach to working in the studio after the motorcycle accident?
After what?
After he had his break with the motorcycle accident, did you notice much change in his recording approach?
I noticed a change in Dylan always. It was like nobody ever knew what he was going to do. I think Dylan is the only prophet we've had probably since Jesus, and I think it'll take 300 years for people to realize that he really did do it. He sank Tin Pan Alley with Moon in June, and then he turned back around and rhymed Moon in June and the Nashville Skyline and John Wesley Hardin thing. But you never knew what he was going to do. You never knew what sound he was going to come with, and just all of that. He just whatever he happened to walk in with or whatever was great to me. I was a fan. I was such a fan of all of these people that I would have done them for nothing anyway. I'd have just said, well, how much will it cost me? You know, that's the way that I felt about them.
Yeah.
And I think it shows in the music because I think it's the best. Now, they'll always make great music, but I think it's the best music. And those records that I did with everybody, it's just they were just in their prime, just sitting there, you know. And it was really something.
Did you have a feeling you were creating history with those albums, Highway 61 and Blonde on Blonde in particular?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And the same thing with Parsley, Sage, and Bookends, and the same thing with Leonard Cohen. The same thing where Johnny Cash came in and bridged that gap, and I brought Dylan in with him, and all of a sudden, country music was popular. All of a sudden, Johnny Cash had an audience. All of a sudden, all of this stuff happened, and it happened. When Dylan came to Nashville, there was an influx of 500 people that came in. I called a couple of hundred myself just to come in and play and listen. Because when I first started in this business, people couldn't play together. They wouldn't let somebody play with somebody else. The record companies had a hold on everything. I know Cash told me one time, Cash wrote me a letter one time and said Dylan wanted to give him a song and asked if I could please get it and not to say anything to the people in Nashville who ran CBS because they'd try to ruin his career. I mean, it was a horror situation, and I started using a bunch of people together. I don't think that I'm the one that bridged the gap, but we just did what the hell we wanted to, and nobody could do anything about it. Before they knew, all they do is tell me not to do something, and that was a red flag up to do it, you know. What could they do? I never had a contract with the artist. They could have got rid of me at any time they chose to, and they chose not to, so I feel real good about that.
You not only produced what is considered one of the greatest albums of Dylan's career, but also one he was largely criticised for, Self-Portrait. How do you look back on that one now?
He came to me and said, Bob, what do you think about me doing some other people's songs on a record? And I said, are you kidding me? Dylan used to walk around and say, what do you think? And I'd say, what possible difference could it make? What the hell I think? And, you know, and then the next time he'd come, I'd say, well, if you had this here, or if we did this or something, but just to let them always know what God in damn difference could it possibly make what anybody ever thought. I thought it was a beautiful album, and if people just listened to it with him singing those people's songs, it's really an amazing thing. But everybody has to judge. I never judged any of those artists. Well, what was best, or was this better than that, or what direction are they going? I never cared. All I cared about was, well, what did they do last time? Let me hear it, you know. And usually, as a rule, I don't think I've ever been disappointed with Dylan. You know, people go and they say, "Oh, he wasn't any good on the." He
beeping because the phone's about to crap out, right?
Okay. Leave it on in there, and I'll come in there if it does. Thanks, Andy. I even forgot what I was saying. He was beeping. Was on my end. If the beeping stops, or if this phone goes dead, I've got the other extension on in there, so I can go in the other room.
Okay.
And what did you ask me? I'm sorry.
I think you're pretty well covered there anyway. That's fine.
Okay.
Now, we talked about some of the great production jobs you've had over the years. Have there been any that just didn't work for you at all?
That didn't work for me at all.
Either the artist was difficult to work with, or you just couldn't get what you wanted in the studio?
There's only been one that I remember, and that was a guy named Chris Hillman with the Byrds, and he asked me to do something on a weekend in San Francisco, and I don't work on weekends, and I didn't want to do it, but I thought, well, I'll go down there. And I went down there, and it was so boring that I nodded out. And his manager said, hey, what's wrong with you? And I said, nothing, why? And he said, well, you went to sleep. And I said, well, I'm bored. He said, well, I don't think we can use you anymore. And I said, oh, thanks a million. And he was a nice boy. I didn't mean anything But his manager wasn't very nice, you know, so I just figured, hell, you know, I'll see you guys around. But I don't remember that because I've always had wonderful engineers and a good studio and great musicians, and it just seemed like if we cut Little Bo Peep, there'd be something happening in it. You know? So, I know I did cabaret with Louis Armstrong from the Broadway show, and just to be able to walk in the room with that man, to be able to hug him, to be able to work with Aretha, be able to work with all of those brilliant people I worked with, or just John Mayall. I went to the East Coast and the West Coast and did a record with him. It never did anything on Polygram, because they didn't know what it was all about. But I used the best musicians in the world on both coasts, and it's quite a record. It's on Polygram. I don't even remember the name of it. But just stuff like that. It's always been pretty good with me, regardless of who it was. I know when I was in England over, I had about 15 or 16 things on the charts continually. It just, all these people were coming with great things, you know, and they were interviewing me, and I basically just said all I ever did was let the tapes roll, because I didn't want to get into what I did and how much of a hero and all of that shit. It's the artist, and they've always been absolutely brilliant, and the artists that I've worked with have always known what they wanted, not diagrammed out so they could go in and do number one and number two or anything. But when we started all together, Dylan was always like, you funnel it in and he funnels it out. Anything he wants to keep, he does, and anything he doesn't, you never heard of it again. Never heard about anything from whoever it was. And I told everybody with Dylan to keep playing. Doesn't matter whether you make a mistake or not, because we can always overdub anything. But if Dylan did something and somebody quit, you may not ever hear that song again.
Yeah.
He'll put the guitar down and go start playing the piano on some waltz tune or something. So I never wanted to miss what he had, because I thought he was not only changing music, he was changing the world. And I think that he and a bunch of those artists are responsible for helping stop Vietnam and helping change the whole attitude of what people are. You know, I think if one day they'll look around and they'll say that guy was a prophet. You know, I really believe that.
Yeah. Simon and Garfunkel, what did you observe about their working relationship while producing them?
The working relationship with them was that Paul Simon was a genius. He always was a genius. He was a writer, he was a producer, he was a player, and Art used to sit there and twist his hair, I remember, and make mathematical equations and do some stuff. But I'd say 90% of everything, the bulk of that, was Paul Simon. It would have been the same success had it been Paul Simon instead of Simon and Garfunkel, which he proved later. So yeah. Paul had a lovely little voice, and he did little things with it and all like that. But Paul Simon was the genius of that group, and Paul Simon was the workhorse of that group.
Now, Charlie Daniels was another whose career you were instrumental in getting off the ground. Tell us a bit about the beginnings of your association there.
Charlie Daniels came into Fort Worth, Texas, and probably before you were born, in 1959, with a group called Jaguar, and I went in and recorded him and got him on Epic. And they dropped him. He had a hit on Epic, and they dropped him. And then he had another record on Epic, and they dropped him. And then just along the way, and then he wanted to come to Nashville, so I moved him into Nashville, and he went to work for me, and I had an extra home out there, so he lived in that for 3 years and got all of his stuff together. And then I used him on about 50 albums and took him around the world on some tours with Leonard Cohen and Jennifer Warnes and those. And that's where Charlie came from, and just an old dear buddy of mine all these years. Great picker, great artist, and just another good one.
Just a few general questions on production. Do you like to work quickly or more methodically in the studio?
The only ones that I've ever worked methodically in a studio with was Paul Simon. Everybody else has always been really quick. I did Blonde on Blonde, I think. Well, Highway 61 was probably a couple of weeks, and Blonde on Blonde was a couple of weeks. John Wesley Hardin was a day and a half. Nashville Skyline was 2 days.
Wow.
It's like everything fell in, and once they did that, what are you going to do? You're going to go back and try to change it for what? I heard that stuff, and it was like, God almighty, what is that? Because in the height of everything, when he did Highway 61 and then he did Blonde on Blonde, everybody in the world was out trying to cut as big a record as they possibly could, regardless of which group it was. And Dylan came back in and said, hey, man, I think I'll do a record with a bass and a drum. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. And I said, and he played me the stuff, and I said, wow, what about Pete Drake? He was a steel player. And I said, what about Pete Drake? Let's use Pete Drake. He said, yeah, get him over here. And so we got the steel player. And during the midst of everybody trying to be as big as they could, he came with a bass and a drum and a steel guitar. The record company thought it was insane. Evidently it wasn't insane, but what do? You just go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
That's what we did.
Do you think that's a common mistake of producers these days, a tendency to overproduce?
I always thought it was a mistake, but what can they do? They got to feed their family, and if you go in and you've got some brand new great artist, and you think he's the best thing in the world, and you play it for an attorney or accountant as they pat their foot out of time, whistle out a tune, and judge what's to be next by what their boss took last week to keep their job 6 months longer, you can't survive the other way. I can and a few people like that, but most people are trying to earn a living and trying to do the best they can and trying to please some new guy that comes in there as head of the company or head of the promotion or whatever, and he thinks he knows what the program director will listen to or the disc jockey that's programmed, and it's been all a vicious cycle because when it first happened, I know Goddard Lieberson said he'd never relinquish control of the company to a non-music man, and he was the chairman of the board for CBS. And I think by the time it was all over, Clive Davis took over, opened the floodgates for accountants, attorneys. I'm not talking about accountants and attorneys. I've always had them. Nothing wrong with them. It's just I always felt they should have had the music people do the music and the accountants and attorneys run the company. And instead of being $1 billion business, it would have been a 15 or 20 or $40 billion business. That's the way I feel about it. But now you don't have that. You have the sameness through radio and through all of the rest of the stuff, except the internet is going to save everybody.
Yeah,
that's what's going to be out there, and it's going to be right the bridge into the new millennium, into the 21st century, and I'm real thrilled about it.
Just before we wind up, Bob, I believe you're in the midst of setting up a record label and an artist management service. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Well, we're going to have a internet label called Ellipse, and we're going to have a regular company which will be called probably World Music. It's WCM World Communications Music, and I want to see if I can start something new. I want to give the artist 50%. I want to give the artist virtual control of it, and I want to let the distributor send the money to the artist bank of their choosing. So Paul Simon or anybody else's attorney and accountant and manager will not have to argue with mine over the theft of their money. That's the way I feel about it, and that's what I'm going to try to start here and see if it goes. And everything looks really beautiful so far. I'd just like to go sign all of the great artists I can, and so never again, as long as they live, would they have to ask anybody anything about anything, especially a bunch of people at a record company.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of artists that'll be glad to hear that.
I hope so. I know we neglected to talk about one, Leonard Cohen, but I toured. I did 2 world tours with him and produced him for 3 or 4 years, and I think he's just one of the most brilliant ones. He was one of the funniest guys I ever met in my life.
Really?
Oh yeah, Leonard was just he was absolutely phenomenal. He was him and Dylan and Willie are just so cool. I know that we were in Vienna and they lost our instruments, and they held them up at the German border. So all the people said, well, I'm not going in there and talk to him. And I said, well, I will. So I went up, and he was in the bathtub in there splashing around with some girl. And I said, hey, Leonard, guess what? And he said, what? And I said, they lost our instruments. They held them up at the German border, and we don't have anything to play with tonight in Vienna. And he started splashing in the water, and he said, oh, boy, we get to do it a cappella. And anybody else in the world would have freaked, you know? Well, Leonard was really cool, and I guess if I can say the last word, I think Willie Nelson is the best singer in the world. Not only is he one of the highest people I've ever been around in my life, and one of the most spiritual, but I think he's the best singer in the world. I always have. Not that that means anything. I just wanted to throw that in Australia. And I wanted to throw in one more thing, too. I know you're not an advertising thing there, but I would really, I've produced with a couple of my sons, and Andy, who's been with me for a long time, my youngest one. I would love to come over to Australia and do some work. I don't know whether it would be for the record companies or for artists that would have their own investment people or what, but I would really love to come over there and hang out for a few months and work with some people if were possible. So maybe out there, the voices that can hear this, my website is www.bobjohnston.com. with a T in it, so who knows? Maybe I'll see you in Australia over there.
We want to look. There's some great talent down here, and I'm sure they would benefit from your experience.
Well, maybe with this radio, maybe some companies or maybe some artists will hear, and I would really love to do it. I always loved Australia. I never got a chance to go there, and always wanted to, so maybe this will be the chance.
Let's hope so. I'll give out that web address a few times during the course of the program too.
Oh, that would be really nice.
Just to drum it in.
I'd love to come to Australia and see it and see the people I've known, a lot of Aussies, and just great people, man.
You'd be a welcome visitor.
That would be fine. That would be wonderful.
Just one final question, Rob. If you had one production job to hang your hat on as the one you're most proud of, if you could single one out, what would it be?
I really couldn't.
You couldn't?
The stuff I did with Leonard, Songs of Love and Hate, I always thought those were paintings, not records, because you don't really have records that last that long, that sell as many and are touted as that. And and Simon and Cash and Dylan and Willie and I guess one of the things I was proudest of, my son and I went to Austin with Willie and produced the IRS tapes that paid his IRS debt off. We didn't get any money because they get it all. I didn't care about that, but just the idea of being able to help Willie, just doing anything to help him as much as he's helped people. Those artists, though, Louis Armstrong and Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen and Johnny Cash and Paul Simon, be awful hard, If you had to be on an island the rest of your life, I would imagine I would pick Dylan.
Yeah.
But I'm really I'm proud mostly of everything that I've done, and with all of those artists, because it was what they wanted. I don't remember anybody ever walking out of a studio saying that goddamn Johnston, if he'd have let me alone, or if I could have done what I wanted or whatever else. They just always walked out and it was their product. You never had to worry about any of that pettiness, I call it.
Okay, Bob. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your contribution to some of my favourite records of all time. It's been a treat speaking with you. I could sit down with you for hours and talk about some individual projects. I might get back to you at another time and maybe focus on some individual albums there and have a longer chat with you.
Anything you'd like at any time, man. Just it's like it's not a big deal. It's like if I can help people understand anything or be a part of having been there or whatever, I'm just another guy out there, man. Everybody puts on their pants with their left or right leg first, or a few with both of them, but there's not any difference other than honor between between all us people. Somebody gets lucky and gets a few bucks. Other than that, we're just all out there trying to muddle through the best we can. And thank God there's a whole bunch of us that are good people out there.
Absolutely. Okay, Bob, well, take care.
You take care and give my best to Australia and the Australian people. Long live Australia.
Okay, stay in touch.
Bye-bye.
See you later.